Thank you for joining us today. This is a Firestorm Founders webinar forum, and we're pleased to have you all with us. Today we're going to be discussing, are you really prepared to respond to an active shooter? We'd also like to have you become our friend. You can like us at Firestorm Solutions on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. Yes, there is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We do want to remind you that the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and this work product should be discussed in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret this information as legal advice or legal opinion.
Thanks, Bill. I wanted to try to introduce the panel now. My name's Jim Satterfield, and we've got a good group today to be able to talk with you about this subject, to think about not only the preparation, but the impacts around it. Suzy Loughlin is one of the founders of Firestorm. Suzy, any thoughts that you want to share at the very beginning?
Thanks, Jim. Looking forward to the opportunity to participate, and I'm hopeful that by the time we hang up, everyone will have a feel for the fact that there are some things that are within our control to manage, both corporately, organizationally, as well as personally.
Thanks, Suzy. And Harry Rhulen is one of the other founders. Harry?
Well, thanks for allowing me to participate. Our guest panelist, Paul Marshall, and myself have spent the last few weeks deeply entrenched in not only the active shooter world, but the overall issue of deadly weapons. As many of you have seen, whenever we have major events go on around the world, and in this particular case, the truck being driven through the crowd in Nice, it pushes some of the mentally unstable people who are thinking of doing things off of the fence, and they actually perpetrate other crimes. We call that copycat violence. And unfortunately, what it's doing is it's expanding the concept of deadly weapons, because obviously we've seen significant knife attacks. We've seen the use of lighter fluid on a subway. We've seen lots of things that are probably also worth thinking about when you're developing your active shooter plan. So I'm looking forward to talking to everybody about that today.
Thanks, Harry. And you mentioned Paul, and everyone can see his picture on the screen and background. Paul, we asked Paul to join us today to bring the perspective from an insurance standpoint. What transfer of risk, what other assets and resources would be available? Paul, any opening comments for us today?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Just really appreciate Firestorm, the whole team, asking me to be on the panel. Just in the last number of months, we've been flooded with inquiries from our partner agents and risk managers around the country, along with various magazines, Insurance Journal, Crittenden, target markets. Everyone is just curious and concerned about having proper insurance in place and the proper response to help possibly eliminate or mitigate any of these horrible events. So look forward to participating. Thanks a lot.
And I think that your comments and Harry's and Suzy's remind us all that every day that we look at the news, there's some other story that's out there, and understanding it from all perspectives. If you're running a company, if you're head of a school, or if you're in the insurance profession, it's really in the headlines. We've seen this being a problem. Firestorm provided the on-the-ground support at Virginia Tech years ago, and when you look at the impacts, we've seen this repeated over and over and over again. So that's really led us to understanding what do you need to do to put in place in front of this? How do you manage it? What do you do during? What do you do after? And I think you're going to hear from the panelists today to get a good insight at each of those levels. So we appreciate everyone on today. I think there are over 400 registrants, or closer to 500. So we should have a good crowd today. And if you've got questions and comments, if we don't get to them live, we'll try to reach out to you afterwards. So that, if we're going to talk about active shooter, and already we've heard about behaviors of concern, some different things come to mind. Harry, you want to start there because you listed a bunch of things just in your opening comments. Active shooter behaviors of concern. What comes to your mind?
You know, I would love to comment on this particular slide, but I think I'd turn it over to Suzy and give her more of the time, only because when you talk about behaviors of concern, you talk about having in place a behavioral risk and threat assessment process that can help your organization to really understand what are behaviors of concern and what to do with them when you see them. And that's part of what we call our Bertha plan, behavioral risk and threat assessment, and Suzy's really the expert on that, so I would give her my time.
All right, well, good. Suzy, we don't get Harry to be quiet very often, so what would you like to say?
That's true, and Harry, thank you very graciously, but I will cover a little more detail on Bertha at the end. But since you've yielded, what I'd like to say about this picture, what comes to mind in particular looking at the gun, is that this is really the far end of the spectrum when it comes to workplace violence. One of my concerns about talking about active shooter, although it's important, as everyone knows, statistically, the numbers, the odds are in your favor that such an event may not happen at your place of business. But let's remember that the workplace violence spectrum encompasses over 2 million cases of workplace violence a year that are reported. Projections are 40% under-reporting. So by the time the person picks up the gun, a lot has typically happened, and specifically talking about our employees. There have been a lot of warning signs along the way, opportunities lost to intervene and provide to this individual before they ever want to bring that gun to work. And that's really the focus of the Behavioral Risk and Threat Assessment Program, which you'll hear more about later.
Thank you, Suzy. Paul, I'll let you jump in now.
Well, it just, you know, we've been, like I said, almost overwhelmed with some of the response with these active shooter issues and that kind of stuff. As you look back at these specific events, you know, what happens, similar to like an airline accident, you know, the standard operating procedure is that people are dispatched on the scene, funeral arrangements are handled, crisis counseling is provided, and so by rolling together a crisis management, a crisis coach program, if you will, coupled with, you know, the funding mechanism, insurance, it allows this to happen in a much, you know, smaller setting, hopefully, you know, when maybe, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 victims, or unfortunately, similar to the Orlando shooting, you know, 50, 60, 70. So I think if combining both the crisis management and the services provided at moment of crisis, and then having that funding vehicle that's automatically there is a nice pair. So
I think everybody's been providing good insight as we think about it, and as we look at this, there's so many interrelated behaviors. Suzy, you did a good job of sharing that it's just not the active shooter. It could be other violence things that are occurring within the workplace that becomes important. And so if we think about it, are we really concerned, is this problem increasing? It's certainly increasing in the media and the comments that we hear in a variety of different areas. Is that just us being desensitized and now it's everywhere, or is it in fact an increasing phenomenon? Harry, since you didn't get to talk much on the first question, would you want to jump on that?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Of course, the answer is yes, it is increasing. So if you look at the number of shootings, you know, one of the easy places to measure that is in schools. So we see it, there's a fairly dramatic increase over the last decade. But also, when you go back to what I was saying before about the mentally unstable, we do a particularly poor job in the United States of dealing with the mentally ill. And what's happening is, because those individuals are now subject to continual bombardment on the television, on their cell phone, on their laptop, on their tablets, they're getting information pushed at them all the time, not only of the events that are occurring in their local community where they used to just see it in the newspaper, now they're seeing what's going on around the world, and it tends to cause a huge additional amount of agitation. So I think it's important to recognize that within your group of employees, statistically, there's a fairly high likelihood that you've got people who have drug, alcohol, spousal, and mental problems. And the likelihood that you are going to see some kind of a violent event in your workforce is going up on a fairly regular basis, again, as a result of the media and social media that they're receiving. So this has become a much more important topic. And I think also what you've seen is that OSHA, from a regulatory standpoint, as well as other regulators, have said, look, this is now a known exposure. There's an expectation that you are going to have done something about it. So there was a recent court case that just came down a couple of weeks ago where they found an employer liable for not having a workplace violence prevention plan in place. So you're going to continue to see that kind of thing develop as time goes on, and I think it's going to accelerate. It's going to be at an ever-increasing pace.
Suzy?
Yeah, Jim, I think what I'd like to add about statistics, it's important for everyone to understand that the official reporting of statistics, whether that's OSHA or DOL or Bureau of Labor Statistics, have a several-year lag, and that's awfully frustrating when we're all trying to make the business case for funding and budgeting and all the things we need, where we have to kind of set forth that value proposition of why we're spending money on something like this, a program like this. Harry's right that the school shooting data is a good place where you can see in real time. You can question, the reliability, but if you go to Wikipedia, for example, they keep track of the numbers of school shootings fairly accurately, and you'll notice a huge increase as it relates to the prior decade. So the workplace data, unfortunately, not very current, and it's basically anecdotal at this point. So just wanted to put that out there.
Well, let me just jump back in for a second, Jim, because the other thing, Suzy mentioned a statistic earlier that there's 2 million reported cases of workplace violence in the United States. Coincidentally, and it is really not a coincidence, there are about 2 million situations reported in schools each year as well. And I think the important thing to remember is when somebody graduates from school, where do they go? They go into the workforce. So those same bullies, those same perpetrators, those same individuals that we're having problems with on the educational level move into our workforce and become our employees. So there's somewhere between 400 and 600 workplace homicides in the United States a year, and it is no coincidence when you look at the numbers that the school numbers and the business numbers track each other fairly closely.
Paul?
Well, I'll come at it from the other end of the spectrum as well. From the insurance agency side, one of our programs is we insure senior care facilities. Well, just to make a point of randomness, in the last couple years in Ohio, there's been 3 active shooter events. Disgruntled employees, disgruntled spouse, whose spouse may be in the dementia ward, and maybe the spouse should be in the dementia ward as well. Lots of depression, going on. So, and then I was at a recent conference with a group of agents who specialize in a senior care liability around the country, and just by bringing the topic up, just about every single agent said, that's happened in my state as well. Not a massive amount, but every single agent was aware of one of their clients having a similar issue. And it's the randomness and just not knowing where it's going to strike next, I think, is the creates the anxiety for us folks in the crisis risk management field. So,
as we've listened to statistics, and you've all provided great numbers and good insight and good admonitions, one of the things that we always are focused on, the fact that every crisis is a human crisis, and that the worst event you're going to see is the one that happens at your office, at your workplace, at your school. And so it's ultimately going to come back to a personal level to be focused on that. And as we go to our next segment, and we're talking about how do you know if you're ready? Do you need to do an assessment? Do you have to have a plan? Is there training? Is there insurance? And the two surveys that you see listed there, and then I'll ask our panelists to comment, you'll notice that does your organization have a documented and trained program? Over half of the people we surveyed, this was a survey of about 500 companies. And then what training did you receive? You'll notice that 71% stated they'd received no training. So if half the people don't have a plan and almost 3/4 haven't been trained, why are we surprised that a workplace violence episode is such a significant disruption? So I'd like us to focus just for a couple of minutes here, if we could, on how does somebody know if they're ready in their company? Where do they start? Suzy, do you want to start on that question?
Sure. I think, Jim, that the word assessment is a good one. The understanding, first of all, you have to know what you're assessing against. So it's important to develop some idea of what best practices are. What are all the things that we can have in place, should have in place to measure against? And thereafter, once we conduct such an assessment, hopefully it yields an indication in the critical areas that a workplace violence program would include, showing you where you may be meeting best practices, where you have a way to go, where perhaps you haven't even put any thought into it. So I think assessment as a tool is a very good one. After that, there's so many pieces, and I know we'll be talking more in depth probably on the next slide, but just in summary, an overall workplace violence program is a function of several components that we view as critical in Firestorm. HR policies, for example, security practices and procedures and tools, having emergency response capabilities so that if, God forbid, the threat does materialize, even with the best of prevention programs, we're not going to prevent everything. So our people really need to know how to perform if disaster does strike. And the piece that I think is really the one that we focus on the most in Firestorm from the prevention side, and that is that behavioral risk and threat assessment program that Harry talked about. It's a process by which we can educate people as to what the warning signs are that a person may exhibit who could be on a path to violence, sometimes years before, and then giving our employees a way to report what they see, including anonymous, because a lot of us just don't want to get involved, but if we can do it anonymously, we're more likely to do that. And then making sure we have a designated group of people in our workplace that have been trained with some skills on how to investigate a report and how to screen a person or know when we got to bring in outside help. Again, the goal is to make sure the gun never gets to work to begin with. And a full workplace violence assessment, a full workplace violence program really goes across that spectrum that I just outlined.
Well, we've talked about assessing here, and we've given some other ideas. Paul, do you have any insights that you want to share on how somebody would know if they're ready?
Well, being the insurance panelist guy, I usually, want to speak on that. Over the last number of months, we've been getting phone calls from risk managers around the country, asking that question, and of course they're asking it specific to, in the last element of formal risk management plan is to contractually shift the risk if you cannot control it, and so that's the element of insurance, and commercial buyers know this. So then we look at the existing policies, and what's happening is there's a reaction in the industry similar to when cyber liability was first brought about a few years ago, where the carriers, the agents are calling me up. They're saying, "Hey, Paul, we just had a 33 a store fast food chain, and we just got a firearms exclusion this year." Another one, their assault and battery was policy limits were reduced and dropped from 5 million to 50,000. And then the other one, has a burglary exclusion. So the insurance industry is reacting because they're the only way they can manage this risk is to create a different entity to handle it. And so that's when we're kind of shifting back to a monoline name para policy that specifically names the risk, such as active shooter, deadly weapon protection, and then provide specific coverages so we know, you have those coverages in place and the responses for that. So
good insights, and I think that what you pointed out is that it's not just the active shooter. Other types of things could be warning signs, indicators, precursors that there's a potential for violence associated in that particular location. Harry, thoughts on this subject?
Well, I guess the first thing I want to point out to everybody on the call, because I don't want anyone to think that we're trying to focus too much on insurance, but there are about 150 insurance agents on today's call, because as you can probably imagine, those of you who are not in the insurance space, this is a huge issue for insurance agents, brokers, insurance companies, because the risk ultimately flows downstream to them. And in a lot of cases, if there's a deadly weapons or active shooter event, the first call that gets made, or the first couple of calls, one is typically to your attorney, and the other one's to your insurance agent. And the last thing you ever want to hear is, oh, that's excluded or that's not covered. And so that's one of the reasons that we are spending some time today talking about the insurance space and the products that are available. I also think it's important that everybody understand that while assessment and planning and training are part of the risk management picture, holistically, so is having some method for indemnification. And I think almost more important, you heard Paul talk about not just active shooter and things like that, but cyber liability. I think the big thing that a cyber liability policy historically has brought to the table is tremendous resources, tremendous skills, both before an event, during an event, and after an event. And I think that that's the same thing that you have here. One of the great things that having a deadly weapons or active shooter policy brings to the table is skills that you wouldn't be able to find otherwise. And then in addition, thought leaders who can help you think through a process that you just wouldn't have access to normally. So I think the holistic approach that we're taking in this webinar is an important approach for everybody to think about.
I appreciate everybody's comments. I think that we're getting issues out on the table and talking about them. And just as we've got a lot of different industries and organizations in place, we can't come and do your job. You know how to make your widgets. You know how to teach in your school. You know all of those various elements. When you get into this area, it's another area of specialization. It's the type of thing that it needs to become a part of the culture within your organization. And when we think about it, and you've already heard several people talking about what do you do before, what do you do during, what do you do after, there are different priorities at each of those three phases, and they align with the Predict, Plan, Perform methodology that you hear us talk about a lot from Firestorm. One of the things that I see advertised regularly is, oh, well, we want active shooter training. And that's because the request comes in as a narrow element. I just want active shooter training. Well, is it you're trying to disarm a person standing there with a gun? Is it you're trying to figure out how to protect at that moment in time? Wouldn't you like to know how not to get into that position? Or wouldn't you like to know how do we care for our people after? Because it's a much broader issue. So I think I'd like our panel to take some time and really start to, you can talk about all three areas, you can talk about one of the three, but give us a little bit better insight into what you see. Harry, you were just speaking, so I think I'll go back to you if that's okay and let you talk a little bit about what do you need to know?
Well, it's interesting. What do you need to know? I think the first thing is cultural. It's really from the top down, understanding and accepting that something could happen. You know, one of the things we talked about earlier was statistics. And statistically, the likelihood that any organization on this call is going to have an active shooter event is very, very small. And historically, I think a lot of organizations have hid behind that as a reason for not doing the planning, the training, the education, for not buying the insurance policy, for not doing those things, because it's what Firestorm has an expression we use, which is disaster denial. And it's no different than the ordinary denial that lets you get out of bed in the morning, but disaster denial is what says it's not going to happen to me, it's not going to be that bad, it's not going to happen here. So that when you're doing your predictive work, when you're doing your vulnerability and threat analysis for your organization, which hopefully all of you are doing on an annual basis and updating, you're not including active shooter and deadly weapons in that predictive process. And by not including it in the predictive process, it then doesn't get into the planning process. And when something does happen, you're not prepared to perform. And that may not be that there's an actual shooter incident. When Suzy was talking a little while ago, and she's going to talk some more about behavioral risk, you're not able to perform from the standpoint of recognizing those behaviors of concern and helping that individual now so that the gun never comes to work. And that whole process, again, I keep using the term holistic, because you really need to look at the risk picture holistically, and this active shooter piece is a plug-in to the overall risk management process.
And I think keeping it in perspective is certainly an important one for all of us as we look through this, and very specific things in the knowing and doing at each of the three stages. Paul, do you want to give us an insight? And then Suzy, I'll ask you to kind of summarize and frame this all for us here. Paul?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think the overall, loss prevention, you identify it, you identify the risk, you plan against it, you do everything you can do to prevent it, but then also you plan just as hard as far as, okay, what if this happens? And then what we want to do is we want to mitigate the outcome. And then you have to look past the denial of this will never happen to us to the point of what if it does? How can we then restore peace of mind? How can we restore confidence in our, our hotel, guests? How can we restore confidence in our school children, our school families, our patrons? And then you kind of get into that as far as, how you save and protect the branding of your organization for the future life of your organization. You don't want an event like this or any other event being mishandled, and then that ultimately unwinds, years and years and years of hard work, blood, sweat, tears in order to build someone's business. So it's just one more thing to work on, and then to create a file and create procedures and move on. And I'm sure something else is going to come up down the road. So,
and it's always something, and I certainly think that's a good insight in sharing. Suzy, what would you tell us about Predict, Plan, Perform?
Well, I want to pick up on a word Paul just used, confidence, which is so vital. It ties back to a couple of other comments. So Harry mentioned about statistics and disaster denial, and it's easy from a predictive perspective to not factor in the likelihood of an armed intruder because it is so remote. At the same time, in a school environment, an education environment where we are given control of other people's children, the explanation to a parent, Mrs. Jones, sorry, we don't have an armed intruder strategy because, statistically it's happening at our school, 1 in 20 million. For Mrs. Jones, that's not going to be an acceptable answer because it's her child. So I think from a confidence perspective, having a plan gives your stakeholders a better feeling about you, and I think a lot of goodwill is earned regarding your organization. The flip side is that post an event, Paul is absolutely right that after you've had any type of episode of violence in your workplace, including a suicide, we dealt with a suicide a year ago that had a dramatic impact on turnover, and we know that statistically, somewhere in an 18-month period, organizations that have had a serious episode of violence can expect up to 60% turnover of their employees. And that's a matter of confidence. People lose confidence in your ability to provide a safe workplace. So if you go do the math and you're talking about that value proposition of why you need a budget for your board, think about what did it cost you to hire and train 60% of your workforce. So, and with that, I'll go quick, Jim, on the Predict.Plan.Perform. I'm going to focus my comments on employee workplace violence because I think the majority of incidents are perpetrated by employees, those that we can control. Terrorism is a whole different threat that I think warrants a different approach to planning. But from the predictive standpoint, what I would say to everyone on the call is the goal is not to hire the wrong people to begin with. So how do we do that? That's by having the appropriate HR screening procedures in place. How do we go about interviewing our employees? What kind of background checks do we do? Do we do employment verification? So Predict is all about how do you become aware and avoid the risk to begin with. Plan, well, we may hire the wrong people. Let's be ready for that. What kind of plans do we need to be ready? We need emergency response plans in case the threat actually becomes reality. And we need a plan to deal with those behaviors of concern that get exhibited, the ones that really give us that opportunity to make a difference in the outcome. And finally, perform, well, that's all about getting our people ready. It's how we train people. It's how we test our plans to make sure they work. And in the active shooter context, Harry has this saying all the time when people call and say we want active shooter training. Great, what are we training to? You need to train to something, a plan, a strategy, a protocol. Without having that, well, you can just go watch the Homeland Security video for 3 minutes and show it to your people, and they're going to get about as much out of that as they will because there's no plan. So again, perform means taking the plan that you created and making it part of your culture, encouraging your people to become their own first responder in whatever that means, whether it's a fire drill that results in the need to evacuate, whether it is a threat that materializes on the inside of your workplace so that people know what are my options. Can I flee? Can I hide? Can I lock down? And all of that, again, can only be understood after a plan has been put in place.
Well, good observations, and I think the idea of personalizing it to your company and to your organization becomes very, very critical. No one wants to have to pick up the phone and call someone and explain that their loved one is not coming home today. The impact of this becomes so disproportionate that's really where we want to make sure that we're prepared so that none of us have to pick up the phone and make the call in those types of areas. Now, as we think about this and we look at it, we've got to see what happens when the warning's triggered. Is it a warning just about a behavior? Look, I think there's something wrong. I've got a person here who was generally good at their job and now they're making mistakes, or they're coming in late, or they're getting argumentative. Is it what's the protocol to do if I see something happening at that point? Suzy mentioned anonymous reporting and coming in, and we're in an environment today where our young people, as they come into the workforce, are going to be more text-oriented than a phone call, being able to send an anonymous text in. It's one thing for you to know what to do, but do your people know what to do? How do they know that? And are you sure associated? When the report comes in of this, who gets it? What do they do with it? Is it divided by threats and types of categorizations? Planning those elements out in advance and understanding them isn't going to make it like our gentleman to the right with a question mark over his head trying to figure it out. The more difficult that it becomes, the less it becomes a part of your culture and the less that it happens. We want to empower our people to tell us about what they see and what they hear, what are they concerned about, so that those interventions can in fact take place. And then the last on that list is, have you tested it? It's one thing to have a piece of paper. It's another thing to have people know what they're supposed to do when they're supposed to do it. Now, we talk about time all the time, and no double pun intended with those two times. And Firestorm, as you all will remember, have retired FBI and Secret Service agents and other law enforcement backgrounds. And one of the common phrases that they'll say is, when seconds really matter, the police will be there in minutes. And when you think about that, that's such an amazing concern, because you're not sitting next to a precinct in an office. You're away from that in a particular area. If you're in a rural location, that response time can be longer. So being prepared helps you deal with that time gap, with that period, until the response can physically be there. You, in essence, are your own first responder, and that's really what we want to think about in each of these areas. So if you're unclear, or worse, if your employees are unclear what's going to happen, then you're not going to make it the most of it. Now, we're going to talk in a minute about some intelligence networks and some other things, but the chart that you look up here, if you'll notice, what you know, that's a big piece of the pie, that big green slice there. And there are a bunch of things that you know that you don't know about, the big blue. But the biggest exposure that we have within all of our companies is what we don't know that we don't know. And you look at that, there are things that are going on in the lives of your employees. There are pressures that they're under. There are things that are happening in the community immediately around us. Now, we monitor regularly weather when we're talking about business continuity programs and knowing, what's a natural disaster that could happen. Are we going to have tornadoes? Are we in the middle of the flooding as we're seeing in Louisiana and other locations as we speak, or the wildfires that are going on out in the West? But having that same ability to know when we're talking about behaviors of concern and those individuals that are on a path to violence becomes so very, very critical. We ask a question about use of an intelligence network to monitor and to give you some insight so that we can help deal with those time issues as they occur. And you'll see here that the vast majority of organizations in the survey don't have an intelligence program, or if they do, they're unaware of it. And by the way, when anyone ever answers that, that's another word for no associated with it. So if we're thinking about intelligence and we're thinking about these types of environments, I think I'll ask Suzy to speak, and Karen, Karen, who is our EVP and Chief Intelligence Officer, we might want to hear from her as we move through the process. So Suzy, I'll let you start here. And when you think about intelligence network, is that important?
Very important, and I'm not going to speak to I'll let Karen speak to the social media piece of it, but when we think of an intelligence network, which is very much part of your behavioral risk and threat management program, and think of intelligence not just coming through technology, but your background check process is a source of intelligence. People reporting, your employees coming forward and telling you that they're concerned about a coworker who used to sit with them all the time at the lunch table and now doesn't want to, or somebody who never was late for work and now she's been late 4 days this week. That's intelligence, and it's information that gives you a chance to do something with it. So when you think about intelligence network, I know that sounds techy, and there is an absolute tech component to it, but it's also some basic things that we've been doing, for a very long time. Karen?
Yeah, I think Karen's good next. Karen?
Thank you. I, of course, concur with everything Suzy said, and it's more than just looking for, a specific word like knife or gun. When we start looking at behaviors that may be a cry for help from the victim, or we start seeing an escalation of disregard for human life, and start really understanding how someone escalates in their anger that may be making threats, by getting out in front, using publicly posted information, nothing private, and just aggregating it so that we can put it in context, becomes a tremendous tool for businesses, schools, universities, and organizations worldwide.
Thanks, Karen. Harry, do you want to comment a little bit about intelligence?
I'm not sure if I want to comment about intelligence only because I'm trying to determine whether I have any.
Don't waste your time, Harry. We know it's not there, so but we'll still listen to you.
Obviously, in today's world, there's an expectation by all of your constituents. So whatever business you're in, whether it's your employees, your clients, your customers, your shareholders, your students, your families, that you be using appropriate technology to identify exposures and mitigate them to the best extent possible. So if you're not doing that, and on subsequent review somebody says, well, how could you not have known this? Here's what was out there. It is a really difficult problem to deal with. And also, I think from a negligence standpoint, I think what you're going to see in the coming years very soon is that there is going to be an expectation that knowledge that was knowable is attributed to the organization. And that's something to really think about when you're putting together your intelligence network and your monitoring processes.
And I'm reminded of a couple of occasions where we've worked with clients, one that had a large warehouse and distribution center, and we set up a geofence around it. And we were monitoring, and we found an employee who made 80 posts in one 8-hour shift, which makes you think about, well, they probably weren't very busy. And it started out that they were bored, they didn't really like their job, they didn't like their supervisor, and it was really a racial issue. And by the time the postings finished at the end of that shift, the last posting said, there's only one way to resolve that, and that's with a gun. I'm going to bring a gun tomorrow, and we're going to settle this once and for all. Well, would you want to know that today, or would you want to know it tomorrow when that individual had already walked in the door with a gun? So understanding in advance becomes important. Similarly, we had a client who had a posting on their Facebook page, an anonymous one, that there was a particular threat made at a specific location. And they promised to go to that location and kill everyone on Friday. The threat came in on a Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock. And Karen and her team started to do research to see if we could figure out who this person was, and discovered first the first name, and then the girlfriend's name, the full name, the home address, and was able to get that back to the client within 2 hours. And they turned it over to the police, who went to the home, and it turned out to be a 17-year-old boy who had worked in the restaurant. Additionally, a geofence was set up around the restaurant to monitor communications in and communications out, and was uncovered that the manager at that restaurant was selling drugs out the back door. Well, there are things that could have been known. And to go back to Harry's point, no one wants to be in a position to say, you could have known this, whether it's a gun in a classroom or some type of activity that's going to be a path to violence. We need to identify that as early as we can. Paul, does any of this intelligence stuff relate to insurance in any way?
Sure does. The the insurance world lives on actuarial data and modeling. This intelligence and how folks, insurance companies, evaluate the risk, likelihood of stuff happening would be, they call them heat maps, where all around the world in the country you have these various crime heat maps, where those are specific to typically third-party crime, right? An assailant type thing. You can also measure, workplace violence, and so the insurance world, where give maybe a particular city, maybe the particular city is maybe hit a little bit harder by recession than others. There's frustration, there's despair. The insurance world kind of monitors these things all around the world, and they're assessing the risk as quickly as possible. So, you know, and then they try to dig into, you know, profiling and identifying specifically, you know, is there anything that we could have done to know about this risk? So similar to anything else, as far as car accidents and that kind of stuff, you know, where they profile the actual insured, they're working hard to build these predictive modeling tools for us. So.
Well, and Paul, I think you've done a good job of setting this up and of where we're trying to go. And so I think the concept that you're hearing from the panelists today is that people just don't snap, that there are going to be some warning signs, there are going to be red flags, there are going to be cues and clues that we can see that there's something potentially there that we should be concerned about. Maybe these are minor, maybe they're not serious, but it's looking at this in its totality, or maybe there's one that's so critical that we can't ignore it. I've asked Suzy to really talk about these behaviors of concern and step you through that and set the stage for us as we are trying to bring home this whole concept around active shooter and behaviors of concern of what we're trying to do. So, Suzy, when we think about this and we talk about kind of a behavioral snapshot, how does all this come together?
Well, Jim, and we're not, obviously, don't get scared, anyone, that we're actually going to go through what's on this slide, but I think it shows kind of the complexity of the factors that are involved. But I think it's also important to understand that the opportunity we have to assess really varies based on who the perpetrator is or the subject is that we're worried about. With the benefit of hindsight, we could take the San Bernardino shooter, or we could take the driver of the truck in Nice, and many other mass shooting or mass injury events, and find that there were behaviors exhibited by these individuals long before they resorted to that final act. The problem is they are dispersed. There are different audiences for the different behaviors, and were they the same audience, you'd get this great opportunity to aggregate all these points and think about them like just like a connect the dots. When you were little, you'd do those diagrams. You have a dot here, and when you're done drawing the dots, you have a horse or a dog. You know, here in a workplace, you have a better chance of connecting dots if the perpetrator is an employee or a former employee, because you spend much more time with that person. So you may find that at work there are behaviors that are exhibited that, for example, someone may see somebody looking at weapons online, or maybe it's the kind of person that is filing a lot of grievances or never feels that they're at fault and never can accept any criticism. Or maybe it's a person that unfortunately could have psychological mental health concerns. There could be delusional thinking and mood disorders. There are so many variables that we've aggregated into these buckets just to try to give you a feel for the categories, and some are much more urgent than others. We have one category called urgent because if you see these behaviors, these are not like, let's gather our threat assessment team together and next week. This is, we're maybe calling 911 or law enforcement. So stalking behaviors and self-injurious behaviors. Self-injurious behaviors are very worrisome because oftentimes people who commit mass shootings, where there are mass casualties, are themselves suicidal. They call it death by cop, and sometimes they're willing to take others with them. So the challenge we have as employers is that we only get a limited opportunity to see certain conduct. We don't get to see what these people are doing at home. But some of the signs in and of themselves are enough to trigger some action, pardon the pun. So again, though, there's no one warning sign that's predictive, and what everyone should understand, there is nothing, no expert will tell you anything is predictive. Just because a person exhibits one or more things on here does not mean they are your next shooter. At the same time, there are some of these warning signs that are more concerning than others. Sometimes when they're multiple, grouped together, that's more concerning than others. A lot of experts will tell you that change is probably one of the greatest things to take note of. That if you always had a person who, you know, complained and from day one and was loud and maybe used curse words, well, that behavior is less concerning than the person who used to be like that and all of a sudden is silent. So through the BERTHA process, our acronym for Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment, we try to help an organization establish a program that gives them some insight into how to understand these behaviors and do something with them. So Jim, if you could go to the next slide just real quickly, awareness training. People need to know what to look for. They need to know that perhaps what they saw is that one dot, that last dot we needed, that let us say to ourselves, we need to intervene and help Johnny. Maybe it was skidding out of the parking lot. Maybe that person didn't know, though, that there were 3 other things Johnny did over the last week that if they had known, they would have been really worried. So getting everyone to understand that they can play such a big role in this process of this predictive, this intelligence network is important. Jim, the next one really is the intelligence network. I think we've talked enough about that. The sources of information are listed on here, and I think we've covered all of them. The next
Suzy, if you just talk a little bit about the key metrics, being late, quality of work, because that's another metric that I don't think we've mentioned at this point.
Right. I mean, and if you go back to that behavior snapshot screen slide, Jim, on there you will see these behaviors, these metrics. There are things that people will exhibit, dramatic changes in their work performance. Maybe their hygiene has started to deteriorate. Maybe they started to use abusive language, or they are acting erratically, or they're coming to work late when they never used to. All of these things are those, I guess you can call them metrics, changes. Again, it's change, and they serve as warning signs. I'm not sure, Jim, if that's what you were getting at.
But I think that's fine in the change, but there are metrics that you can start to think about that are good indicators of that change that Suzy referenced. So, Suzy, we need to keep all those things together somewhere, don't we?
We do, and I think this is again, think of all the dots. So we've now seen lots of dots, but they don't show a picture till we can put them all in one place. And Harry has, could probably talk to this very specifically regarding a situation we were involved in, that really it was because of that inability to aggregate the information that the decision makers, when they were trying to determine, do we have a person we're worried about that could be on a path to violence, they didn't have all the dots, and therefore the opportunity was lost, and unfortunately it had a horrific outcome. So having a central repository could be as simple as an accordion folder where you put pieces of paper in where someone gives you a tip or a report, or it could be a sophisticated software application that resides on your phone that would aggregate all of those texts and emails and phone messages and things that come through about a person. So having that repository becomes a resource for your team at work to screen behavior. The plan is the document, the process that helps that threat team that you've designated take all of the necessary steps to be sure they've conducted themselves in accordance with best practices. So that team of people, the threat management team, I think we call them, is the group of people, typically multidisciplinary. It could include a representative of HR and IT and security and facilities and risk, depending on how you're structured. You want it to be multidisciplinary because you want the varying expertise to be brought to the table. You want these people trained to properly investigate reports related to threats and behaviors of concern. And most importantly, you want these people to know when the situation is at a level that, frankly, it should be escalated to either a third-party expert like a forensic psychologist, a police psychologist, somebody who's in the profession of making an assessment as to dangerousness. And that is not something that most lay people can do. So all of these things really are illustrated in a program here that Jim has just put up on the slide, and it shows you all of the pieces that go into a behavioral risk and threat assessment program, beginning with that awareness and that intelligence, and having the ability to report it, whether it's being received by a call center, which frankly is an approach that we recommend because many businesses and schools, for example, are closed after a certain hour, and unfortunately we learn that Lots of behaviors, particularly suicidal-related issues, will arise later in the evening, and if there's somebody that can receive that report at whatever hour, that is really helpful. The threat team, as we talked about, that team then also needs to develop a plan. Some companies will say, you know what, we're not going to bother with this person, we're just firing this person. Well, that may or may not work out for you. If you just fire them, you've taken away the ability to monitor them. You don't know if they're going to be escalating in their behavior that's worrisome or de-escalating. And that is vital to understand. So preferably putting someone on leave while you have time to truly evaluate their situation could be advantageous. Whatever the plan is you come up with for that person, maybe you have an EAP and you're sending them for anger management, or you're sending them for sensitivity training, or you're sending them to, you believe perhaps they need drug and alcohol rehabilitation. All of that works its way into a plan with metrics as to when that person is allowed to re-enter the workforce. And then once they get back, it's not over. What do we do to make sure that they're doing better? What are the check-in points? So all of that becomes part of your program.
And there's obviously, we can't cover every detail in our webinar today, but we'd certainly be glad to share. I think the recommendations are coming around that you need to take action, that focusing on behaviors of concern in addition to thinking about active shooter becomes very critical. The reporting, the ability to do the threat assessment, the awareness training, involvement to make it part of the culture within your organization, the intelligence network to be able to track it, finding out the support channels that you have within your area. And as Paul has pointed out, there are insurance solutions that are available today that were not available before. So the next steps, predict. Develop an awareness and prevention training program within your organization, establish this intelligence network, develop a workplace violence prevention program, make sure you do have the emergency response protocols there. What are you going to do if, in fact, these things that we've been talking about? If you need assistance, Firestorm has a program called Crisis Stop that we can help you in that first critical hour in a crisis to know what to do or what to say, because the decisions and actions and communications that you make in that first hour become extremely critical. I would recommend that you look at insurance as a portion of your solution here, and as well as an analysis of your current plans, and then test your plan to see if people know what needs to be done. There is a brief from today's webinar. You can download that at firestorm.com, and it gives you a chance to go through some of the slides, listen, look at the comments that have been made to make a determination. So when we think about that, can you identify your next thoughts? Are you ready? Are you sure? How do you know? We can, but more importantly, you can, and I think that's what we'd like you to carry home today. So if we have a last word, Paul, do you have a last word you want to share with everyone?
Just really appreciate the opportunity to address these issues. I know it's a little difficult. You're kind of looking at, identifying, hunting down the boogeyman inside the house, but just because you don't want to look for him doesn't mean he or she's not there. So I think it's just time that we address the issue and move forward and prepare and have the confidence that we've done everything we can do to prevent and then mitigate a horrible event like this happening on our place of business.
Suzy?
I think, Jim, what I'd like to add is almost a regret that we didn't have more time, because I know that top of mind for a lot of people are more recent events that fall more in the bucket of terrorism, I would say. And although I think we spent the majority of time talking about active shooter in the context of our employee or former employee, as statistically, we're back to statistics, it is far more likely that that will be the scenario you face. But for those entities that are listening that perhaps have more customer-facing operations, retail and hospitality and restaurants and nightclubs, there's a lot of information I'm sure you're still looking for, and I think it would be great, Jim, if we could schedule a successive opportunity to talk about that specifically.
Harry, one last word?
Well, I actually have more than one last word because I've been watching the text and the chat that's been coming up alongside, and we have a lot of folks who have questions. So I want to let everybody know that we are always available to answer your questions after a webinar or anything else, so don't hesitate to reach out. Those of you who are Firestorm clients, obviously you know how to get us. Those of you who are agents, please don't hesitate to call Paul Marshall at McGowan, and he can certainly coordinate any kind of communication. If it needs to be, more than just a phone call, we can do that. And also, I know a lot of you wanted to know what some of the case information is that we were referring to. We can get you the actual sites to, for example, the OSHA finding, the holding against the home health care company that had the problem. And then also, I know a lot of you were asking questions about what does the typical active shooter event cost to manage in the aftermath? And it's a very difficult question to answer. I think the easy answer would be to say, on the low side is probably $50,000 and up. The high side, it's very hard to estimate. The actual hard costs are probably $500,000, but what is the long-term ramification to an organization? How much does it actually cost in terms of lost employees, lost business, all of these things? Obviously, it's in the millions of dollars. So if you're an insurance agent trying to figure out limits for your insured, talk that through with Paul, talk that through with us. We can help you with that. It's really going to depend on the type of business that they're in, the type of exposure that they have. But they are real dollars. And again, I think as important or more important than the indemnification dollars are the services that get brought to the table that the insured wouldn't otherwise have access to.
Thanks, Harry, and I think that's a good wrap-up and a summary for everyone. Our contact information is on the screen. You can go to the website. You can send us an email or call us at 800-321-2219. Thanks for your time. Thanks for all that you're doing in your companies every day to make our workplaces safer and help our employees. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Until our next webinar, Jim Satterfield at Firestorm, have a great day. Goodbye.
Thanks, Jim.